Hi, welcome to session number 8 of Pirates, Smugglers, and the Making of the Modern World. In today's session, we're going to stay within the general chronological framework that we've been working on over the past 7 weeks or so, and that is talking about a period roughly encompassed by the years 1500 to 1800. But we're going to shift focus in the sense of centering our attention today on smuggling as opposed to piracy, which has been the main concern of most of the lectures that preceded this. So we're going to be looking more at smugglers and their specific activities and factors that affected their development, and we're going to focus in particular on Great Britain and its colonies in North America, specifically the 13 North American colonies that eventually became this country. Now, in addition to that, we are starting to look a little bit forward. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to be shifting into the 19th and especially the 20th centuries. And there are some themes that I'm going to touch on today that are highly relevant for what we're going to be doing in the weeks ahead. One of the things that we're looking at today is smuggling in the context not of trading empires, even though England was a trading empire. At least that's not going to be our focus in the first half. We're going to look at Great Britain as a nation and how do its national policies affect smuggling within this country itself. Only when we get to the second half today and talk about the American colonies will we really be looking at trading empires again and how they affect smugglers. Here we're going to look at how issues like duties and taxes, etc., or attempts to block certain kinds of goods actually affect the national economy, and specifically how they lead to the proliferation of smugglers, especially in Great Britain. That is going to be relevant in the weeks ahead because as we look at smuggling, especially in the 20th century, we'll be looking at most cases at smuggling that is prompted by national policies. A second thing that we're going to be looking at today when we get to the second half that is highly relevant for the future has to do with smugglers in the New England colonies and how smugglers impacted both the outbreak of the American Revolution and its eventual successful completion. Up to now, when we've talked about smugglers, and certainly when we've talked about pirates, we're mostly looking at the political aspect from the perspective of how do state policies help piracy flourish, or how do decisions to eliminate piracy lead to the suppression of piracy or smuggling activities. Today, when we look at the American colonies, we're going to look at it from a different perspective. How do smugglers affect political outcomes? What role did they play in bringing about the American Revolution? The importance of this for the weeks ahead is the following. At the very beginning of the course, I mentioned that really pirates and smugglers are involved in a symbiotic relationship with the state systems that they operate within. We've already seen the state's side of this, in other words, why states may decide to work with pirates, encourage piracy, or allow piracy to take place. But we have to see the other side of it too. In other words, from in this case, the smuggler's perspective, what is so essential about this reality, about the existence of these states and their policies that lead these in this case, these smugglers, to come into existence and do the things they do. So it's going to reveal in a more compelling way that indeed we're dealing with one system here. It isn't just conventional merchants and conventional trading activity here and then criminal activity or piracy and smuggling over there. They're really part of one system, and the story of the New England smugglers helps bring that out a bit. The third issue that's going to come up, particularly in the first half today, is that up until now when we've talked about goods being pirated or smuggled, we're talking about goods that have been given a price boost as a result of the creation of monopolies. For example, the Portuguese in their attempt at least to monopolize the spice trade, or goods that have gone up in price because they are being traded within a closed trading empire. Those have economic logic behind them. In other words, the price of this good has gone up. It's a viable target for either pirates or smugglers because there are specific economic logics that lead countries to try to cause an increase in prices and gain greater profit. But what about a case where a state decides not on economic grounds, essentially, but on the grounds that a good represents a specific social evil, that it is a danger to society? We're going to look at one such case today, going back to as early as the 17th century, where a state system decides that a particular economic good is in fact a threat to its society and will seek in some ways to ban it, but if not ban it, then essentially tax it out of existence. This is going to be relevant in the weeks ahead because as we get into the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at things like prohibition, in other words, prohibition on alcoholic beverages in this country in the 1920s. We're going to be looking at the drug trade, both in Asia and then later, specifically here in the United States. And even in the case of cigarettes, we're going to be looking at products that state systems have determined are inimical to the interests of their own societies, and they're therefore going to try to ban them. And this brings in a new set of dynamics because, as we know, with piracy and smuggling, there are certain economic policies you can pursue to try to diminish it. If you reduce tariffs and duties, etc., well, goods are less attractive, they're not as high a price, not as worth smuggling, and less attractive for pirates to seize. But if the state is committed to trying to tax or ban this good out of existence, it doesn't have that kind of flexibility. It can't respond by saying, well, we're simply going to allow this good to be traded because they see it as a fundamental evil. So the responses, the flexibility of state systems are far less in those kinds of cases, and we're going to see the first such case of a product which is defined, at least by the political system, as being inimical to its society. We're going to see the first such case where they attempt to ban and then tax such a good out of existence and what actually happens in the long run. And that'll be relevant for our discussions in the 20th century. But first, let's look at English smuggling, how it began, and how smugglers responded to a variety of changing state policies over time. We begin back in the 13th century. It is at this time that the English government, for the first time, really establishes a formal customs system. In other words, a system to tax goods that are coming into the country or going out of the country. So a set of customs duties are established, a rate book is established, setting up what are those duties, what goods do they affect. Now, along the way, of course, it becomes essential to have somebody to collect the duties or the taxes. Initially, this is handled by the usual port officials, people who are there as harbor masters and regulating the traffic within a harbor. But by 1275, the necessity arises of actually appointing people who have this as their sole function, the actual collection of the duties for goods coming in and out of the country. From the beginning, and for almost 500 years to come, there are not going to be enough people to do this. The state is not going to commit sufficient resources to put customs officials in every port in England. And as a result, the customs system, at least for the next few centuries, is going to focus on the major ports, particularly London, where so much of England's trade took place. Whereas the minor ports, the lesser ports around the country, are going to be left on their own. Essentially, local harbor officials, people in the port, will be responsible for collecting the duties, the tariff, whatever might be due. And as you can imagine, it isn't very efficient because this is not the primary responsibility of these people. They're not going to devote a lot of time and attention to collecting those duties. It's going to be done most effectively in the larger cities like London. Now, even with London, we've got some significant problems. Remember when we talked about the Spanish Empire and I pointed out issues involving the purchase of office and so forth that diminished the effectiveness of early modern bureaucracies? Well, very similar problems are afflicting England at this time as well. Bureaucracies don't work very well in the early modern period. This is illustrated by the history of the customs service early on. The first thing to do was, of course, to appoint customs collectors. People would actually be responsible for being in the customs house and for collecting the duty on goods coming in and out. However, they discovered that, in fact, believe it or not, many of the customs officials were being bribed. As a result of that, they then appointed a group of officials known as controllers to watch the customs officials. In fact, in the ports, what would happen is that there is a customs seal for each port where they would stamp the goods indicating that indeed the duty had been paid. This seal was split in half, and the original customs collector and then the controller each had a half. So each of them would have to confirm that indeed the good had paid the duty. The idea that, well, now we've got someone watching, it's like the bee watcher and the one who was established to watch the bee watcher, and so forth and so on. In fact, they got to a third level of surveyors, who were then responsible for a region and for visiting the customs houses there and determining that, in fact, everything was on the up and up and officials weren't being bribed. Not surprisingly, this stacking of one bureaucrat on top of another to watch each other wasn't very effective, because it didn't solve the basic problems within the customs system. And the basic problem was simply that people were not paid very much. In fact, they didn't really have salaries. They got a portion of the fees that they collected. And this was never a very large amount of money. Another problem was that these positions were usually patronage appointments. In other words, someone got the job because they were owed a political favor, they had done something for some member of the nobility or whatever, so they were given the position. And people did not look upon these appointments as really full-time jobs for themselves. In fact, they usually passed it on to someone else. Someone else down the road might pass the job on yet again. So by the time a customs collector showed up, he's sort of at the end of a chain of people, from the person who originally received the appointment and passed it on down, doing a favor to some subordinate who does a favor to some subordinate. They're usually about 4 or 5 people removed from the original recipient of the appointment. And of course, everybody's going to get a cut of whatever the customs official actually makes. It is therefore unlikely that you're going to get very professional, very devoted individuals who are responsible for these kinds of operations and for the efficient collection of duties. And it was generally considered a common practice to be bribing those officials in the port. And if you had to, you'd bribe 2 or 3. If it's not just the collector, but the controller as well, so be it. Now, most duties at the beginning were export duties. They were duties on goods that England was sending out of the country. And the one that was most important was wool. This was a time when England's economy was driven, at least its international economy, driven especially by the export of wool to countries where it was being processed, Spain, the Netherlands, etc. So this was the key export for England at this time, and it was the logical target of export duties. However, again, this is not a modern bureaucracy, and the kings and queens were inclined to grant special favors to political favorites. In other words, they were given licenses so that they could export wool duty-free. Needless to say, the existence of such licenses only encourages smuggling, because people look at it and say, well, he doesn't have to pay anything because he's a political favorite. Why should I have to pay anything? Logical outcome, I'm going to smuggle my goods, because apparently the government really isn't that worried about collecting its taxes. It's letting other people export it for free. The fact that the duty fell on what was perhaps the most important export product being produced in the English countryside at this time, and that many people looked upon it as an unjust imposition, particularly when a few royal favorites actually got to export without paying duty, led to considerable sympathy within individual communities for the smugglers. People looked upon this, first of all, many of them were themselves, raising sheep. They were the sheep herders. It was their product that was being exported, and of course their return was being impacted by the export duty. So most people in the countryside looked favorably upon people who were involved in smuggling activities. Again, as you can imagine, it's going to be rather difficult to enforce a law requiring the payment of duties when local communities favor the smugglers. If this is a law that does not have a great deal of popular support, and again, this is a little bit like prohibition later on, it's fine that you impose a law that says you have to pay a tax or this particular product is forbidden, but if you're running contrary to the general will and intent of the population, it's going to be rather difficult to enforce. Therefore, smugglers could readily look to local communities for protection. If they had to outrun the customs official, hide product until they could get it offshore, etc., they had a number of willing individuals within the community who would assist them in those efforts. Furthermore, England's reputation as a place where you could always bribe a customs official was very much international. The Senate in the city of Venice, an important trading partner of England at this time, actually passed a bill approving bribery payments for British officials. I mean, this was a public act, but it was this was a part of doing business, the cost of doing business. You don't pay the duty, you pay the customs official, and you don't have to pay anything. So this practice is truly widespread. And there was a general sort of folk legend that wasn't really a legend even, an acceptance of the fact that customs officials were often from less than substantial circumstances, the people who actually took the jobs, and yet within a year of taking such a job, they were known for tables that were bounded in spices and wine. Suddenly they had become quite well off, coming from literally nothing. And people knew where this was coming from. Of course, this was being paid in kind. The people who were importing spices and wines were paying off these customs officials. So it became almost an accepted fact that this is the way the system worked. Yeah, that there was some collection of duties, but much of it was never paid because so much of what was happening was the form of bribes that kept the customs officials from looking too closely. Now, while the Venetians and other Europeans spent their time paying off officials, particularly in London and the larger cities, the Dutch took a different approach. When we talked about the Dutch before in the creation of their empire, I pointed out that they were a very careful group of business people. They hated to spend a lot of money. They were very efficient with their use of money. And their approach was, well, why should we bother bribing those officials? All we'll do is go to any one of a number of smaller ports that don't have customs officials, and we can virtually land what we want and smuggle these goods in without having to pay that extra cost. So the Dutch were well known for visiting the smaller ports of England and carrying out their smuggling activities there, where generally speaking there wasn't even a customs official that you would have to bribe. Now as we get into the 1500s, things start to get more serious in terms of this process. First of all, in 1558, the government issues a new rate system, the revised Book of Rates, which, not surprisingly, we all know what happens with taxes usually, are raising the rates. So it's getting to be more expensive. And in fact, the sudden increase in duties actually impacted the trade of Great Britain at this time. Some of this was due to other factors. There had been a considerable run-up and improvement in trade for a number of years. But one of the factors that is a drag on England's international trade at this point are the increased duties, and therefore, particularly products leaving England are more expensive. They're not going to sell as well. And of course, goods coming in are going to be more expensive. They're not going to be bought as readily. Another major development at this time that has consequences for centuries to come is the issuance of the Corn Laws. And basically what the Corn Laws are a prohibition on the export of corn and other basic commodities from England itself. This is not a surprising kind of piece of legislation at this time because, as we've seen, there were always problems with food supply in these centuries. In the early modern period, there was always a concern that there would be a shortage of food, whether it was due to drought or disease in the crops. So here the concern was to prevent England from suffering food shortages by preventing the export of basic foodstuffs that were being generated in England. But what, of course, this also means is it's a tremendous incentive to smuggle again, because otherwise you can't even send the product out of the country. So the only way you can export is by smuggling. Now, when we look at this and you realize that smuggling is still rife in the middle of the 16th century, in the 1550s and beyond, and that this whole customs system was created back in the 13th century, in the 1200s, you have to conclude that apparently the government isn't trying that hard. They are raising the rates, and they have created a system of customs officials, but it's obvious that these people are being bribed left and right, and that they're still not even assigning these people to positions out in the smaller ports so that you can smuggle as much as you want out there. One reason for this, and we saw some of this, for example, with Spain and especially Portugal, is that the crown, the king, or in this case the queen, Elizabeth I, has to be concerned with how far she pushes the merchant class. First of all, the government can essentially accept the fact that it's going to get revenues out of the duty system, something it didn't get in the past. So there is an income. The government is getting a take of some kind, even if many people are ignoring the duty system, smuggling, going around it, what have you. So it is getting money. But beyond that, Elizabeth, like other monarchs, depended upon the merchant class for emergency loans, for example, when the treasury ran dry, and that often happened in early modern regimes throughout Europe and the rest of the world. And then there's another factor. The Royal Navy, if it can be called that, was not a very large force. Most countries, England included, could not afford to maintain a large standing navy. So what inevitably happened, and would happen, for example, in 1588, with long-term historical consequences when the Spanish decided to send their armada and tried to essentially conquer England, what would happen in times of warfare is that the Crown looked towards merchant groups to provide their vessels, to refit them, and send them out as part of a royal naval force. So a queen like Elizabeth I had a great deal to lose from antagonizing the merchants. So if the system seems to be, irrational in the sense that, well, why bother having duties if you're not even going to try to enforce them in many places, and you're going to allow this system to continue where there is widespread bribery of the officials who do function? Well, there are reasons you don't want to push the merchant class too far. Yes, you've got laws about import duties, export duties, etc. But the fact is, if you push the merchant class too far, they're going to become alienated from the regime, and they are not going to provide the kind of support that you're going to need at times. So this is still not a modern state, a modern bureaucracy. It cannot count on a standing or a large standing armed force to use on a regular basis, and it really needs to look towards the merchants for both that and for financial assistance at times. So the government is willing to essentially content itself with a fraction of what would have been its regular income from these duties. So if smuggling is going on at this time on a large scale, we know it's happening in part because the government has essentially accepted this status quo. Now, there were attempts to improve the system. One involves a man named Thomas Smythe, who was well known as a corrupt customs official. I mean, he was typical. He was assigned in London, and he was well known for taking bribes. In fact, he later admitted himself that he had taken a large number of bribes in this job and helped improve his financial situation quite a bit. However, Elizabeth decided to act upon the idea that it takes a thief to catch a thief. So what she did with Smythe is that she made him a tax farmer. Now, tax farming is a long, I won't say esteemed, but certainly ancient tradition. From the time of the ancient Babylonians down to the time of Elizabeth and beyond, governments had realized that it was rather difficult to collect taxes. That meant having some kind of bureaucracy, and most governments really didn't have anything approximating a bureaucracy at this time. So what they would do is essentially lease out the right to collect taxes to people called tax farmers. It's a little bit like when you have a parking ticket or a traffic ticket, and the city turns it over to a law firm, and they send you letters, etc. And of course, what's going to happen is they get a percentage of what they collect. Same kind of thing is happening here, and of course, who better to assign to it than Smythe, who had knew all the tricks of smuggling and bribe taking, and he was highly successful. In fact, he became a very wealthy man in the years ahead by carrying out this activity. Needless to say, he was also very unpopular with a lot of merchants in London. But on the other hand, with this profit motive in mind, the government could, in fact, significantly enhance its collections, at least in London itself. That, of course, leaves the outlying districts. As far as the lesser ports, in other words, the smaller ports in England, there still weren't any customs officials there. The policy was, let sleeping dogs lie, we're not going to worry about what's going on out there. Now, this may seem truly irrational, because you're thinking, well, and there were only 8 major ports that had customs officials. So what's happening in all these other little places, these fishing villages and minor port cities, what's going on there? And it would seem logical, at least, that, well, why didn't all the smugglers, which were most of the merchants of the time, why didn't they just start sailing into and out of the smaller ports? Wouldn't be a bad idea, except the government knew the reality of the national economy and infrastructure. And it was this, that if you wanted to sail into one of the smaller ports, these places have considerably less in the way of infrastructure, namely roads, to get you from where you are now to where the market is. If you're an importer, for example, the things that are worth smuggling in as imports are things like spices and wines, silks, and we'll see things like tobacco, etc. Items which for one reason or another bear a fairly high price, they're luxury consumer items. Well, you're not going to find a lot of luxury consumers in small towns and fishing villages. You have to go to London, you have to go to the major cities. So the problem for smugglers is if they can get the goods in there, then they have to face the problem of transporting goods over what are atrocious roads. These are not paved roads. They're horrible to travel in the winter. Carts and so forth are not very efficient. And you have, of course, the danger of highwaymen who will fall upon you and steal your goods. So the government knew that, well, it was leaving those ports uncovered. There was a limited amount of smuggling that was going to go on in those places because the infrastructure, the transportation system, wasn't going to make it very economically efficient for smugglers to move their goods down. It became much more difficult to deal in those kinds of products, the ones that had the highest profit, by going to those small ports. Now, another way that smuggling did occur was in the coasting trade. In other words, ships that sail from one port, let's say from Cornwall to London, carrying goods. That's the coasting trade. That's where you're staying within the domestic system of ports. Now, the government required, when you were shipping goods in that way, that you post a bond. In other words, here's a 100-pound bond guaranteeing that my shipment of wool I am taking from here in Cornwall and I'm taking it to London. So I don't owe any duties for export. However, merchants got around that as well. What they would do is they would take out a bond for 25 bales of wool, let us say. And those are the 25 bales that they had to deliver to London. Meanwhile, they'd load the ship with 50. Sail directly from Cornwall over to Amsterdam, sell 25 bales there for a very handsome sum because they wouldn't have to pay any export duty, and then sail back to London and deliver the 25 that guaranteed their bond. So a very simple system of using paperwork to cover up smuggling by pretending that these goods are staying within the coasting trade when in fact they're being exported overseas. Another issue was that aside from, let us say, the sympathy that many smugglers, particularly smugglers of wool out of the country, enjoyed within the community, a fair number of prominent people were also involved in either smuggling or piracy. The Killigrew family, for example, Lord Killigrew was known to be engaged in smuggling activities and specifically pirate activities. His crews would go out, fall upon a foreign merchant vessel, steal the products before they even got to port, and then smuggle them in themselves, saving the foreigners the need to smuggle them in on their own account. Lady Killigrew, who's his dearly beloved spouse, also participated in these activities. She was known to board ships and clobber people over the head with a metal rod before relieving the crew and of their cargo. So it was sort of a family activity. The family of the pirates together stays together. There were a number of such instances of fairly prominent people, people who held titles and were prominent figures in various parts of England who engaged in this kind of activity. In some ways, this is a reflection of this fact, that, yes, England has a monarchy, and it has had a series of monarchs. The Tudors were known, Henry VIII, and particularly Elizabeth, his daughter, for their efforts to centralize power. But the reality is that in England and other societies at this time, the monarch has the power that they do because of a series of relationships that they have created with other members of the nobility, the landowning class in the country. These are agreements, essentially, that we accept rule by the monarchy, but in turn we have a right to retain certain powers. We have been given certain grants of land, certain privileges from the crown, and we retain the right to exercise those. And very often, members of the nobility in the countryside paid little heed to what was supposed to be national policy. So yeah, we know the government has a national policy on not smuggling goods in, but this is a tradition we've had. We've been free to import goods at our small port for the past 500 years, since time immemorial. We're not going to surrender that kind of authority now. So many of these people don't see themselves as criminals. They see themselves as simply exercising certain privileges and rights that they've had for centuries. This is a monarchy, but it does not have the kinds of powers we normally associate with a modern centralized government. Now, the 17th century brings another increase in taxes, not surprisingly, and particularly increases on import duties, so that now more than before, whereas past smuggling was particularly dominated by the smuggling export of wool, now more and more focus is starting to come on to the importation of goods and the smuggling of those goods brought in. It's at this time as well, in the 1600s, that we see more of professional smugglers. Up until this time, for most people involved in smuggling, it's a part-time occupation, or it's a portion of what they do. Most people are merchants who are engaged in this process. Their primary activity is legitimate mercantile activity, exporting and importing of goods. All of them, most of them at least, at some time or other, smuggle goods to add to their profits, to deal with the problem of high duties. But none of them in the earlier centuries would have really seen themselves as professional smugglers, that this is how I make my living, is primarily by smuggling goods. Now, as we get into the 1600s, there are more people who are involved with smuggling on a full-time basis, where it becomes their occupation, essentially. And now there is specialization, as we always get when professions develop. Specifically, the building of boats, ships that are specifically designed for smuggling operations. In particular, they would be smaller boats. They would have shallower drafts that would allow them to move into smaller ports and even up river estuaries in order to deliver goods or to bring goods out of the interior of the country. So we get a larger group of people now who are doing this on a regular basis and who are doing it essentially as a profession. In response to that, one of the things that the government will do at this stage is set up what are known as customs syndicates. This is taking the Thomas Smythe example and expanding it, essentially saying, well, what we need are what we would call private stock companies. In other words, a group of investors who come together, and the purpose of this enterprise is to collect customs duties, and they would invest in that enterprise. The government would grant them the power to collect the duties in the hopes that they, given the profit motive, would be far more effective than the customs officials themselves. They also set up at this time the system of a board of customs, so that you now have a group of people appointed to manage the customs system, to make appointments to the various collectors and controllers positions, and to try to regularize the functioning of the whole system a bit more, to see to it that there are actually vessels acquired which are used to chase smugglers and to try to bring them to justice. So if the pirates are the smugglers are professionalizing, the government is doing some of that itself to have a more coherent system that will actually be responsible for the collection of duties. Now, the specific increase in duties in the 1600s came in the formulation of a new book of rates in 1604. The only important part of that we're concerned about is that a product listed in there was a new product in Great Britain's economy, and it would become the target of a major government campaign. Now, this was not just another product and another spice or, another form of wine being added to the list. This product was going to stand out because of the exceptional treatment it would receive from the British government over time. Specifically, it was, as James I called it, the evil weed tobacco. Tobacco begins to be imported into England here in 1565 from the Americas, where it is grown, and it quickly begins to develop a significant following. It becomes a very important consumer product. Not surprisingly, by the 1590s, the government imposed the first duties on tobacco. At the time, these were intended, like other duties, simply to generate some revenue from what was obviously a popular import. And, as logic would follow, by 1598, we have the first smuggling of tobacco, the first seizures of smuggled tobacco, so that we know that by this time tobacco is being smuggled. It's certainly the normal life cycle, if you will, of products in England at this time, that they start to be imported, they impose a duty, and the next thing you know, people are trying to smuggle to get around it. But tobacco is the example that I mentioned at the beginning that stands out here because in this period, by the early 1600s, tobacco was not viewed by the king, James I, as just another import that was to be taxed in order to raise money. He saw tobacco as having a deleterious effect upon society, that it had a corrupting influence on people. From James's perspective, it would be seen as the modern-day equivalent of marijuana, that this is the kind of thing that corrupts people's minds. They sit around in a smoky haze all day. They don't work. Of course, they kind of smell bad from the tobacco, but mostly he sees this as a sign of corrupt lifestyle, and that this activity of smoking tobacco encourages this kind of corrupt lifestyle. He was a bit of a prig, and so not surprising that he would take that kind of perspective on something that, you know, seemed to have no purpose other than people just sitting around and enjoying themselves smoking tobacco. It certainly wasn't a very constructive activity. So here's a situation where the state, at least the monarch, has decided that this is a product that is going to have a negative effect on his society. And therefore, he tries to ban it originally, and then he will try to tax it out of existence. Specifically, a 20-fold increase in the duty. This is what we're getting in 1604, that suddenly the duty on tobacco is skyrocketing because James's purpose here is not to get more money. He wants the importation of tobacco to end because he wants to make it so expensive that people just won't be able to afford it. He will discover, as people who fight the drug wars in the future, that raising the price of one of these products doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It isn't necessarily going to drive people away from consumption. It may lower consumption somewhat or slow up the spread of consumption because more and more people are smoking tobacco in England at this time, but it doesn't necessarily end the problem. People just don't say, well, gee, you know, if that were the case, when you look at cigarettes in this country now and the taxes on them, by now you would have thought people would have said, oh, far too expensive, I can't afford that. Well, no, it doesn't necessarily do that. Demand remained high. It may have slowed, as I said, the spread of tobacco, but demand continued. And now James would try another gimmick, licensed tobacconists. In other words, tobacco could only be sold by certain people who had licenses from the royal government. And in fact, they had to be sold in sealed pouches. It's almost like they were giving out prescription drugs, you know, that you had to have a license to do this. You could only give out a certain amount. The end result was that, in fact, there was a huge amount of smuggling of tobacco. In fact, the estimates are that 90% of all tobacco consumed in England in the 1600s, 1700s, and the 1800s was smuggled in. For example, in a typical year at this time, England would import about 8 million pounds of tobacco. It's a lot. And you would think, well, you know, if you got 8 million pounds of legal imports, then people must be smoking up a storm. In fact, 90% of it was for re-export. In other words, it was brought from the American colonies into London and then shipped off to other countries. So the British are not smoking this stuff that's paid the import duty. What they're smoking is all the stuff that's been smuggled in. So about 90% of it is smuggled in. Tobacco will be an ongoing problem for the government even down to today. I mean, cigarette smuggling in England today is almost as much of a problem as the smuggling of tobacco was back in the early 1600s. One of the issues that comes up here is because James, at least, not all government officials are driven by this, but because he's driven by this idea that it's essentially an evil, rolling back the import duties, rolling back taxes becomes very difficult. One, because politicians there, here, can always argue, well, this is a tax on something that's not good for you anyway, so, there's really not a problem in raising taxes. And secondly, it's hard to argue for a rollback in taxes, even though you could say, well, it'll reduce smuggling, because people say, well, we don't want to encourage people to smoke, so the last thing we want to do is lower the price. So once a product is identified in this way as being inimical to the interests of society, it's very easy to raise taxes on it, and it's very hard to lower them. You don't have that kind of flexibility as you do with other products. The argument that you'll reduce smuggling isn't nearly as powerful as the argument that it'll encourage people to do it. Now, another problem that's affecting England's trade and encouraging smuggling at this time is the East India Company. It's the monopoly company that we saw that the British established for trade in Asia with India and China and so forth. And not surprisingly, it has a monopoly on bringing these goods, such as tea, from Asia and importing them into England. So that right there, prices are going to go up. Even without duties and taxes, which also exist, the very fact that this company has monopoly control over certain imports, like tea, that's going to be a problem. Prices are going to be high even without taxes. Smuggling is going to occur. And in fact, a good deal of it occurred in the form of private trading. And what they meant by private trading was simply this, that the people working for the East India Company themselves smuggled stuff in. And it was a perfect opportunity. We saw this with the Portuguese sailors, with Spanish sailors. Well, English sailors working for the East India Company did the same thing. If they were bringing tea in, they'd try to sneak on a few chests for themselves, smuggle it into the country, and sell it at a nice profit. So once again, we see these monopoly systems, even within their own core, have smugglers that are doing the opposite of what you would think was in the best interest of the company. Another factor that arises to affect smuggling at this time is the imposition of excise taxes. England suffers through a civil war from 1642 to 1649. James's son Charles he loses his head over it, literally. But for our purposes, the importance of the Civil War in 1642 is that government costs go up a lot when you're trying to fight a civil war. They're looking for new revenues, and they come up with what's called the excise tax, which was to be paid essentially between a wholesaler and a retailer. In other words, if you make a product, you sell it to the wholesaler, then it's the wholesaler's job to impose the excise tax before he passes it on to the retailer. So it's not a sales tax. That's why it's not a sales tax. It's called an excise tax because it happens there between a wholesaler and a retailer rather than at the consumer end going beyond the retailer. In any case, it's another burden that's put on things like tobacco, tea, that they're going to have to pay this excise tax. Product is going to cost even more beyond what the duties impose. Now there are domestic taxes, all the more reason to smuggle. And of course, by now, smugglers are getting more professional. They're designing ships with spaces to hide things like tea and tobacco so that even when they're inspected when they come into port, even if you have an honest customs official who's actually trying to find the stuff, they're going to have difficulty doing that. Meanwhile, the truth is that even as we progress through the 1600s, customs officials weren't looking all that hard to find the stuff to begin with because bribery remained king of the customs system. Officials were still being bribed hand over fist to ensure that these goods could pass in or out of the country without paying these duties. Then in 1614, there was an edict banning the export of wool, which we won't go into, again, some of the specifics for it, but as you can imagine, people who had for a very long time been making their living by exporting wool from Great Britain. Now it's not a matter of the taxes are too high, now you can't do it at all. And of course, that kind of ban is absolutely going to lead to a surge in smuggling because the benefit to you is absolute. It isn't a matter of, well, gee, if I don't smuggle, I have to pay 50 cents for every bale of wool. Now it's a matter, if I don't smuggle, I can't export at all. I can't make any profit. Another problem for the system is that even when smugglers are caught, local courts are highly unwilling to convict smugglers. That sympathy within the community that we talked about persists certainly through the 1600s, and local courts are very sympathetic, particularly to people who have had to face the fact that wool exports are being banned. They're sympathetic to these producers and these merchants who are trying, from their perspective, just trying to make a living against what they see as illogical government policies. And so the regime faces the fact that even when they catch these people, they very rarely go to jail. The solution to this is to begin fining communities when they don't find a smuggler guilty. We might consider this a bit strange, the jury goes in and you know that if you don't find the person guilty of the crime, you're going to have to pay money. What they would do is, they did this with the most notorious case. If a notorious smuggler was found innocent by a local jury, they had a list, of course, of all the major property owners. That's how you paid your basic taxes. And every property owner would have to pay a share of a major fine imposed on the community. The idea of trying to discipline communities and get them to convict these people who were guilty of smuggling. But the fact that it had to be done is a pretty good indication that they weren't getting very many convictions in the courts. Another persistent problem is this one about medieval rights that people claim. The Isle of Man off the coast of England was a hotspot for smuggling. And it was a hotspot for smuggling because the Earls of Derby were the hereditary rulers of the Isle of Man, which was technically a part of England, but also had certain rights that had been granted to it by the monarchy in centuries past. And they insisted that among those was the right to control trade in and out of the island. And they didn't charge any import or export duties. And of course, being close to the coast, this is an ideal opportunity if you're coming from France, from Amsterdam, wherever. You can stop there and load your cargo into small boats that then flit across a very narrow distance of the sea and land your cargoes and smuggle them in that way. So it becomes another major mechanism by which smuggling can not only go on, but actually can flourish. Now, we're going to talk about the American colonies in the second half of today's session in some detail and their relationship within this trading empire that England was creating. Up until now, we've been focusing basically on England as a national economy and what was being done with import and export duties and creation of a customs system and how that led to the flourishing of smuggling in these centuries. But there is always an imperial element to England's economic policies, and this becomes clear in the 1600s as well. Beginning in 1650, England began regulating the trade of the colonies. By now, the colonies were sufficiently developed with their economies that England wants to control that trade in terms of imports and exports. And beginning in 1660, it wants to specifically direct that trade, establish a system which is very similar to what Spain has with its colonies in the Americas, and that is what's called a mercantilist system, or for our purpose, simply a closed trading system, where goods from the colonies can only be shipped to England, and the colonies can only purchase goods from England. Now, there are exceptions to this, but that's the ideal, and that's what they're striving for. And the Navigation Acts, which were issued over the course of more than 100 years, starting in 1660, were part of this process of creating that system. Not surprisingly, and as we will see in more detail in the second half, the creation of the Navigation Acts, the creation of this closed trading system with the colonies in North America, leads to smuggling. Specifically, Scottish ports were being used for smuggling these goods and for getting goods to the colonies without paying many of the duties that had to be paid normally. For example, there's a requirement that these goods come through England. That requirement is designed to prevent products from being imported into the colonies from other countries without paying some kind of duty to the British government. In other words, they don't want the Netherlands or France and others shipping goods directly to the American colonies and not having to pay a duty to the English government. However, the Scottish essentially got around this because since they were a part of a larger Great Britain, they would leave their ports, stop briefly, literally, at an English port without paying any duties, of course, because technically they were just on a coastal trading mission, and then head off to the American colonies to smuggle their goods in. And at the time would present a document demonstrating that indeed we had appeared in, we were in London, we were in this port or that port in England, so we've met that requirement. But of course what they were doing was just going in, picking up a document as a coasting vessel saying that yes, they had visited the port, but not paying any duties. So Scotland and the Scots find a way to take advantage of this closed trading system and start smuggling goods. Indeed, the 18th century, when many of the navigation acts came into full force, became the sort of golden age of smuggling in England. One of the reasons is this closed trading system that England is creating with its North American colonies and with its valuable colony in India, etc. All of this naturally is going to increase the rate of smuggling because now there are all these controls on products coming to and from these colonial possessions. That's one reason why it happens. Another reason is that by this time, the number of, shall we say, full-time smugglers, professional smugglers, had grown considerably, and there were believed to be about 20,000 smugglers, and we're talking about people who do it all the time, not people who just occasionally smuggle goods, but who do this as a profession, out of a population of about 8 million people. So you have the development of a fairly substantial body of professional smugglers. Another factor explaining the increase in smuggling at this point is that by the 18th century, tea, like tobacco before it, has become this extremely popular consumer good. And England up until the 1600s, we always think of the British as, tea drinkers, tea time, and so forth. The fact is, none of that happened until we get to the 17th century, till we see the import of tea from China, and it is then that tea sort of swept through England, and by the 18th century, the British have this reputation of being tea drinkers. Everybody drinks tea. It is the national drink. As a result, there is this huge consumer demand, but of course there's a problem, and that is tea imports are controlled by the East India Company. It has a monopoly on that trade. Specifically, what happens is that only the East India Company is allowed to bring tea into British ports. It cannot sell it itself. It has to auction the tea off to wholesalers who will then do the actual distribution throughout the country and arrange sales in that fashion. However, along the way, there are three things that happen. One is that the East India Company does have a monopoly. It can control the supply and therefore can keep prices high. Two, the East India Company has to pay an import duty on that tea when it's brought in. And of course, they're going to do that because they're a government monopoly. They have their monopoly granted from the government, so they cannot afford, as a company at least, even though private individuals within the company may be smuggling, the company has to ensure that certainly the vast majority of the tea chests that come into England are going to pay that duty because they have a vested interest. If the government takes their monopoly away, they're out of luck. And then the third factor is that in the sale from the wholesalers who buy it at auction, and then when they sell it to retailers, there's the excise due tax. So you have a tax, you have a duty, and you have a monopoly. All three of them weighing on tea. So tea, and of course, because of this relationship between the East India Company and the government, you know that compliance and the payment of the duty is going to be very high. So you have these three factors all contributing to very high prices for tea. And why was that? No, it was not seen as an evil as tobacco had been seen. It was simply seen as a great way to earn taxes for the government. Tax collection is always a difficult process for early modern governments. Squeezing money out of landowners and peasants is a difficult task. But when you've got international commerce and when you've got a consumer good of such value that's sold openly on the streets, here's an opportunity to tax something and gain a great deal of revenue. It's hard, at least within the official retail system, the conventional retail system, to avoid paying those taxes. So it was simply a very easy way to raise money. Imports are running around 3 million pounds a year. So again, the British are consuming a great deal of tea. And in fact, their expenditures on this are one of the highest consumer expenditures of any product in England or in Europe at this time. So this is a mass market of true form. Now, in the 18th century, as smuggling became such a widespread problem, the English government began experimenting with a variety of solutions. And by now, they've had about 500 years of experience with the customs system, customs duties, and with smuggling. One of the experiments is simply this: start lowering the excise tax on tea. If you lower taxes, call them duties, taxes. A tax is what you charge domestically. The duty is on the import or export. If you lower the expense created by duties, by taxes in this case, by the excise tax, you lower the cost and the price ultimately to the consumer. Therefore, you narrow the profit margin for a smuggler. You know, if the duty is 50% of the original import price of the product, potentially there's nearly 50% profit by smuggling, because you don't have to, if you smuggle, you don't pay the duty. Now, if you cut it to 25%, okay, well, now profits are only 25%. And you do have, of course, the risk of being a smuggler. So simply by reducing taxes or import duties, you can reduce smuggling. And that experiment was tried with tea at this time, and we'll see that it's tried again later on in the American colonies with quite interesting results. As you would assume, of course, consumers would be quite happy to know that, taxes are going down, particularly on basic consumer goods, or what is considered now a basic consumer good, even if smugglers may be unhappy. However, this experiment didn't last at this time. Eventually, England's going to get around to free trade and to eliminating or vastly reducing import duties. But at this point, the experiment doesn't last. In 1759, they increased customs duties. They had lowered the excise tax, that's true. But the customs duties on tea, which for the consumer's purpose, really the same thing, it's because it's going to increase the price again, go up. And by 1783, you're looking at 119% duty on tea. In other words, if the duties, if the tea is worth $100, then the duty on it is $118. So you're more than doubling the price of the product, and you can understand why when you start doing this again and raising the duties or the taxes, people are going to turn to smuggling again. Smuggling of tea will flourish once more. Now, another way that the British were coming around to getting rid of smuggling, or at least reducing it substantially, was by the development of revenue cruisers, the development of vessels specifically designed for chasing the smugglers. And by 1775, they've got 44 of these. Although that number is insufficient, they still can't cover the smaller ports, and they still can't even adequately defend all of the major ports. But they're getting a more professionalized approach to this, where they now have vessels specifically designed for that purpose. As the government starts to become somewhat more efficient in tracking down and punishing smugglers. Remember, they're pressuring courts to convict them. They now have a more effective way of chasing them. The smuggling gangs themselves start to become more violent. Up until this time, until the latter part of the 18th century, there was very little in the way of violence. And occasionally, a customs officer would try to arrest somebody and they'd get hit over the head and so forth. But by the latter part of the 18th century, there were far more incidents of violence by organized smuggling gangs. They were much more likely to actually initiate violence, to actually kill someone, a customs officer or whatever, as a part of their plan of getting goods in and out of the country. Part of this is understandable in this way, that as the penalties are being enforced and are becoming more easy to enforce by the use of these revenue cruises, the risk is going up. When the risk goes up in terms of the penalty, people who engage in smuggling on an occasional basis in particular are going to start walking away from this. Those who are left, who are willing to still take this increased risk, are often going to be from a criminal element. I mean, when enforcement of laws are lax, people will be inclined to break them. If you speed, you get caught speeding or running through a red light, okay, you have to pay a fine. But nobody's going to send you to jail. So most people, one time or another, will break that law or those laws. On the other hand, most people are not going to try to hijack a car by pointing a gun at somebody's head because they know, other than the fact, well, I'm not inclined to do that in general, but most people at the very least will be discouraged from doing that kind of activity because the penalties are so high. As you start raising the penalties and you start enforcing them more effectively, you raise that risk and you tend to remove the sort of casual smuggler. And to a greater extent, the trade becomes controlled by criminal elements. We're going to see the same thing with drugs, that when the drug trade was relatively casual in the earlier 20th century, there wasn't a lot of violence, etc. But as the government starts to crack down, more and more it's going to become a criminal enterprise and violence is going to increase, which is what happened in England with smuggling in general. And as a result, the government's response has been here, well, we'll up the penalties even further then. If they're criminals and they're violent, now it's the death penalty for smuggling. Also, the government tried to increase enforcement by using the Royal Navy, by sending Royal Naval vessels out to help enforce the customs duties and work with the customs cruises. However, it must also be pointed out that, as with drug smuggling, when the U.S. government gets involved and sets up a series of agencies in the 20th century to try to stop that smuggling, here too, sailors in the Royal Navy often get involved in smuggling themselves. They're now engaged in kind of activity where they have access to smuggled goods. You stick a few away. When you get back to port, you get them off the ship, and you sell those goods without paying a duty. So it certainly improved enforcement by adding these Royal Naval vessels to the squadron that was enforcing the customs duties, but it also includes a certain corrupting of the enforcement force itself as sailors take advantage of what would be very spectacular profits for some of these goods like tea and tobacco to do a little bit of smuggling on their own. So it has an overall beneficial effect in terms of enforcement, but at the same time it is going to have a corrupting influence on a portion of the Royal Navy. Now, another kind of smuggling that's also taking place at this time on a regular basis is general re-export smuggling. And again, a simple way that this works. You are in the colonies, and you are going to export goods. You say that you are exporting them to London, and from there they will be shipped on to the Netherlands. You get the goods to London, and therefore you're not going to have to pay, either you won't pay any import duties or you'll pay very light import duties because this is a re-export. It's not going to stay in the English economy. But in fact, what you do when you get to London, you unload the ship there, smuggle the goods in. You've already gotten this far. You've gotten past the customs officials in the sense you've presented this document showing you're re-exporting. So all I have to do is wait for nightfall, hopefully, without a cruiser around. You unload the ship. The goods are sold in England, and meanwhile you sail off to God knows where, pretending that you're off to Amsterdam to re-export your goods. So the idea is, I'm only stopping here. This is a re-export. I'm just stopping here on the way to Amsterdam, but in fact what you're doing is unloading the goods. Another form of smuggling. Now, with smuggling getting to be such a problem, and it certainly was in the 18th century, one of the solutions that the regime comes up with, besides executing people, is the transportation of smugglers. Being transported was not a social benefit, not for the smugglers. Transporting was a way of dealing with criminals. People were sent to the colonies. Australia, of course, has a reputation of being a colony that was literally created for the purpose of transporting criminals to it. And this is how the colony came into existence, essentially. But these people were often transported to the North American colonies as well, get them out of here where they're committing these criminal acts. Well, not surprisingly, when you transport a smuggler from London to Boston, all you have now is a smuggler that works in Boston instead of London. So this, in fact, well, it may have made things appear better in England, was in fact adding many professional smugglers to the colonial economies that were still working with England. So they just, shift around exactly where they're shipping what to whom, but they're still smugglers. So in the short term, it's good domestic policy because you can tell people we're doing something, we're sending these people off to the ends of the earth. But in fact, if you look at the overall imperial economy, it's not going to have very much beneficial effect because these people are just going to take up their old trades once they get to the colonies. And of course, smuggling in the colonies was a significant problem in its own right. In the colonies itself, and we're going to come back and look at this, as I said, in the second half when we look at the North American colonies, about 5/6 of the tea that was consumed in the colonies, this isn't quite as high as in England itself, but about 5/6 of it, the overwhelming bulk of it, was being smuggled into the country, or into the colonies, I should say. So here, too, as in England itself, violation of the customs rules, violation of the navigation acts that governed the colonial economies and their actions with England were being violated left and right. And again, as in England itself, a considerable portion of the merchant community was involved in these activities. Most of them still would not be considered professional smugglers. Most of them still, as in earlier times, did this on a part-time basis, but it was a significant portion of even legitimate business, and there were people, as we will see, who devoted themselves almost exclusively to smuggling as a profession, as a way of making a living. So the problems that are in England are readily apparent in the colonies as well, and in fact, it was even more difficult, of course, to enforce customs laws in the far distant colonies than it was in England itself. The crown is removed by several thousand miles from the colonies. It's harder to find and correct corruption. It's harder to get people to even take the jobs of being customs officials in the colonies because people don't want to leave England. So in general, enforcement, if anything, is more lax in the colonies than it is in England itself. Now, another factor involving the American colonies is, for England, the American Revolution actually meant a substantial increase in smuggling once again. Despite trying to fiddle with excise taxes and reduce them and reduce smuggling, despite the revenue cruises and despite adding the Royal Navy to this armada that was trying to enforce customs duties, what happens, of course, with the revolution in the North American colonies is that a significant portion of the Royal Navy has to be sent across the sea to help deal with the revolution. That means fewer vessels are available for purposes of enforcing customs duties along the English coast, and smugglers are going to get away more frequently now that there are fewer vessels chasing them. By 1784, the English government was back trying to experiment with ways of reducing smuggling. And in 1784, there's a slashing of duties on tea for consumption or for tea that's being imported into England. We'll see a somewhat different timing on the story in the North American colonies. But in 1784, the English government once again tries this experiment that we can reduce smuggling if we reduce the duties. That way there'll be more legitimate trade. And one of the rationales here is that, look, if most of the tea is being smuggled in anyways, then hardly anybody's paying, the official duty. If we reduce it and more people are then willing to actually import tea on a legitimate basis, that means the taxable base will increase. More legitimately imported tea, more legally imported tea, even though it's only paying a 25% duty instead of a 50% duty, if we double the amount of legally imported tea, actually the duty should return as much revenue to us at 25% as it did at 50%. So it should help in decrease smuggling, but also we shouldn't see a fall in revenues if we can encourage people to use the legitimate channels for import. Also in 1786, you get a reducing of duties on French goods. The idea here again is we can improve revenue by getting more people to use legitimate channels for trade, and at the same time we can reduce smuggling by making it less attractive, by making the profit margin lower. In 1784, the government also passed what was called the Hovering Act. You weren't allowed to hover anymore. Literally, the Hovering Act prohibited vessels from standing offshore for prolonged periods. In other words, you couldn't just anchor off the coast near London and sit there or sail back and forth for days at a time. The Royal Navy or the revenue cruisers could stop you and take over your vessel and inspect it for smuggled goods. The logic here was, and this was true, that smugglers didn't want to go into port. The best thing to do was lay offshore and wait for the smaller boats that would come out and offload the cargo and take it on shore and be able to get it past the customs officials by not actually going to the official customs house. So a lot of smuggling took place by ships essentially sailing back and forth until the smugglers onshore were notified of their presence and go out and reach them and offload the ships. So that would reduce it. Nevertheless, 7.5 million pounds of tobacco being smuggled every year into England, indicating that for some goods, yeah, they're improving their situation, they're improving compliance, but tobacco was not going to be one of those that was going to see reduction in duties or excise taxes, because tobacco, of course, is seen as an evil. It's not James I anymore, but still people see this as a product that you really don't want to encourage the use of, and therefore we should keep the duties and the taxes high. And it's still, even with a low level of compliance, a pretty good source of revenue for the government. Again, in the early 1800s, smuggling surges once again because of the war between France and England, as France is being ruled by Napoleon Bonaparte. One of the things the British did in their wars against Napoleon Bonaparte was to enforce a trade embargo on continental Europe. Napoleon, of course, had come to control much of continental Europe, not just France, and therefore the British were not going to allow exports or imports between those areas that Napoleon controlled and their own economy. Surprise, surprise, smuggling is going on all over the place because, of course, people have been accustomed to carrying out this trade for centuries, and suddenly tell them they can't engage in any trade at all, of course, is going to send them off and make all of them turn into smugglers. That would subside again after 1815, once the Napoleonic Wars were over, and when these embargoes of various kinds are lifted, smuggling will decrease rapidly back to its old levels. Another thing that's done by the beginning of the 19th century is an upgrading of personnel. By this time, there are 10,000 officials in the customs service, and now they're actually being paid salaries. You actually have the beginnings of a real paid bureaucracy, and people who actually have to have some kind of credential and actually have to be reviewed in terms of their past work behavior and so forth in order to be admitted into these jobs. There's still political patronage, but many of the jobs are now being filled on a more rational basis, so you're getting better performance by the customs officials. And increasingly, as enforcement gets better, and as duties are lowered so that many consumer goods, aside from tobacco, of course, are not paying as high excise tax or as high a duty, public opinion towards smugglers begins to turn, and more people begin to see smugglers as criminals. Part of this, of course, is because many smugglers now came from the criminal classes because of the higher penalties and the greater degree of enforcement. Most casual smugglers don't want to take that risk anymore, but part of it's also because if prices are lower, then you're not such a hero anymore for smuggling, whatever it may be, a wine or whatever it is, some cloth into the country. Well, it's not that high a duty. You're not doing me that much of a favor. You're not a great hero. You're not saving the economy. So smugglers are often viewed more as criminals, and therefore the actual enforcement of the laws by courts is improving. There's a real decline by the 1830s in smuggling in England, due largely to the fact that England, by 1784, has begun this process of lowering particularly duties, but also some excise taxes. The one exception to that rule, which will remain which is why this is an important example for what we're going to be looking at in terms of banned substances like alcohol in the 1920s and a variety of controlled substances in the 20th century. The one good old standby is tobacco. There, the rates reach an incredible 1,100%, meaning you're increasing the price of this product once you impose that duty 11-fold. You know, if it was $1 for a bag of tobacco, well, it's now $12 because $11 is just the duty that you pay. So tobacco goes on into the 19th century, even as smuggling is declining. It's a product that will go on being smuggled throughout the 19th and into the 20th centuries. Now we'll see when we come back to look at the world economy next week that we're on the verge of free trade, where duties of all kinds are going to be lowered and where types of trade are going to change. And all of this is going to lead to a worldwide decline in smuggling in the course of the 19th century. But up until the beginning of the 19th century, England's experience was that of most countries, that high duties and inefficient customs systems led to widespread outbreaks of smuggling, and in case of some products, more of the product was being smuggled than was being imported legitimately. When we come back, we're going to look at the American colonies around this same time and see what their experience was with smuggling and the political importance of smugglers in the American Revolution.